Hello and welcome to the second unit of Principles and Practice of Translation. Today's lecture is entitled Translation-Oriented Source Text Analysis, Principles and Applications. Today we'll be learning about a model for source text analysis proposed by Christiane Nort. Now, what makes source text analysis so important to the translator? Well, clearly, if we are going to produce a functionally adequate target text, we need to understand what the functions of the source text are and have a very, very clear idea of how the source text works in order to adjust it and adapt it for our purposes. So Nort uses the basis of skopos theory to elaborate her model for source text analysis. Her model is specifically translation-oriented, and source text analysis provides a reliable basis upon which to make translation decisions. Her model is general enough to be applied to all languages and for all purposes. It's user-friendly, it's ideal for trainees, and it helps justify our decisions and systematize our processes when we are doing translations. The system that she proposes is extremely detailed and formulaic, and you'll be learning how to apply it step by step. But that said, these sorts of skills become second nature to you as you progress through your training as translators and as you progress in your career. So all translators will naturally perform source text analysis in the process of their work, but it will with time become a automatic process. So let's begin with a quote from Nort, which says that a text is a communicative action which can be realized by a combination of both verbal and non-verbal means. Now, what does she mean here? So she means that a text is more complicated than it might first appear. The meaning, the force, the effects of a text are the sum of a number of factors which are both internal to the text and external to the text. The internal factors refer to the context. What comes along with the text? What words are used? Are there pictures, diagrams? What does the formatting and design say about the text? What kind of language is used? What is the register? External factors refer to the context of the text's production and reception. When, where, and for whom was the text produced? What influence does this have on the meaning or form of the text? And how will all of these factors influence the form the translation takes? She goes on to say that the reception of a text depends on the individual expectations of the recipient, which are determined by the situation in which he receives the text, as well as his social background, his world knowledge, and/or his communicative needs. So what she's saying here is that a text is only realized, in the sense made real, when it is read. It comes to life at that point. The reader completes the loop of the text that is begun by the source text producer. Texts are pieces of design. They're crafted with a purpose. They're active. They're not inert. This is why skopos theory puts so much emphasis on ascertaining and analyzing the function of any given text. What makes this assertion so critical for translation? Clearly, if we take seriously the idea that the reception of the text, that is to say, the way in which it will be read and the effects it will have, are dependent on the expectations of the reader, who are nested in a social situation with world knowledge and specific communicative needs, then any given text, when presented to a new audience, will need to be altered in fundamental or subtle ways to its new environment in order for it to act as a functional product. And for a text to be functional, it has to adapt itself to its new environment. And that's why Nort says that text type conventions are not universal, but are linked to a certain culture at a certain time. Now, what this means is that cultures and languages expect texts to work differently. They expect different levels of language to be used. The way the text looks, the language use, these will all differ between different languages and cultures. And our job when translating a text is to make it functional. And for that reason, we need to adapt our text to the norms, the textual and cultural norms of the receiving audience, as they influence that kind of text type. I'll give you an example. I've included here an Italian directions of use for aspirin, which I decided to translate as an example for you of this issue of textual norms differing across languages. So the Italian says, nonostante aspirina sia un farmaco vendibile senza obbligo di prescrizione medica, sarebbe opportuno consultare il proprio medico prima di intraprendere l'assunzione di questo medicinale, avendo cura di estendere la terapia per un periodo non superiore ai 5 giorni, al fine di ridurre gli effetti collaterali associati alla terapia con acido acetilsalicilico. Sarebbe opportuno assumere aspirina preferibilmente a stomaco pieno e nelle più basse dosi possibili. The English, which I've translated literally so that you can see how the Italian works, reads as follows. Despite aspirin being a drug which may be sold without needing a medical prescription, it would be appropriate to consult your doctor before beginning to take this drug, taking care to extend treatment for not longer than a period of 5 days. In order to reduce side effects associated with treatment with acetylsalicylic acid, it would be appropriate to take aspirin on a full stomach and at the lowest doses possible. So we can see that the Italian text offers some information which contextualizes the instructions. We can also see that the language use is it's giving a suggestion. It would be appropriate. You should take care, as opposed to giving direct instructions. So in order to understand the textual conventions of this kind of text type, I found a similar text in English which reads, follow the directions on the package or prescription label carefully and ask your doctor or pharmacist to explain any part that you do not understand. Take aspirin exactly as directed. Do not take more or less of it, or take it more often than directed by the package label or prescribed by your doctor. Now we can see that the way the language is used is very different. So what was highlighted in purple in the literal translation doesn't exist in a similar text. There's no background information. There's no statements of fact. There's just pure, direct orders. Follow the directions. Ask your doctor. Take aspirin. Do not take. So there is none of this hedging language. There is no use of modal verbs. It is a much more direct form of language that is typical in this kind of text in English. So with that in mind, we retranslate the Italian into English as aspirin is sold over the counter with no need for a prescription, but consult your doctor before starting treatment. Do not take for longer than 5 days. Take aspirin at the lowest dose possible and on an empty stomach to reduce side effects. So you can see how I have transferred the meaning of the Italian in an extremely accurate way, but have filtered it through the textual norms and the expectations of an English reader in reading such a text type. And this is why the literal translation which I offered would not be appropriate, whereas the adapted translation would be. And that's why, in the simplest terms, we say you have to translate words, not meaning. Okay, sorry, meaning, not words. And this is what makes it so important, is that each language will express itself in a different way, and that meaning will be effective only if we assume the textual norms of our target language. Okay. And very similar to what I've done here, you'll see the arrows. I've included a loop. So I've started with the Italian source text. I've done a literal translation into English. I've compared it against similar texts in English, and I've then produced an appropriate target text in English, which I then compare back against the source text for accuracy. This is similar to what Nort proposes as her looping model for translation. You'll see on the screen that she has on the left, as I did, the source text which is embedded in a source culture. Following source text analysis, we end up with a translation of relevant elements. We do a transfer into the target language. We synthesize a target text, which will then be nested within a target culture, and we compare it against the source text for accuracy. So on the extreme right and on the extreme left of the diagram, I have loyalty and function. So those are the twin poles. If you go back to the Italian, you'll see that I have in no way misrepresented the meaning of the source text with my appropriate target text. I have, however, made it a more functional text than the literal translation would be. So this is the balance that this looping model allows us to achieve. On the one hand, not misrepresenting the source text, that is our imperative of loyalty, and on the other hand, producing a text that is functional. So this looping model describes the translation process, which is nested in the idea of source text analysis from a functional perspective. Now, Nort goes on to provide us with an extremely detailed checklist of factors that we can look for when we are analyzing a text. These include extra textual elements, which are who transmits, what for, to whom, by which medium, where, when, why, and the intratextual factors, on what subject matter, what does he say, what doesn't he say, in what order, using which non-verbal elements, in which words, in what kind of sentences, in which tone, and to what effect. So these are all questions you ask yourself when you are reading a text and preparing to translate it. And those two things, extratextual and intratextual factors, they combine to produce a text with a function. And ultimately we are always asking ourselves, what is the text's function? And what will its function be in the target language? And how do I achieve a functional text? What do I need to do to create a text that is appropriate in English, or appropriate in isiZulu, or appropriate in whatever target language I'm using? And not only in terms of the language, but in terms of where the text will be published, for whom, what is their level of education, what is their purpose for reading the text. So these are all things that you see get filtered through our decision-making process in producing a functional target text. So away with the idea that translation is a mechanical process of taking words in one language and putting them in another, and say hello to this negotiation of meaning, text, and function in order to produce usable products. This could go as far as work in the area of intralingual translation. So often you might be asked to rephrase or rewrite something even within your own language for a different audience, and all these questions would apply in the same way. So how do we find this information out? So how do we find out about the sender, about who transmits? Translation relevant information can be found in the text environment, imprints, blurbs, notes. It can be based on your general knowledge, your presumed knowledge about the transmitter. Is it a person? Is it an institution? What can I discover about the writer? Anything about the sender will have a strong influence on what the text is all about and how its function will be inscribed. The sender's identity will inform our analysis of his or her intentions in producing a text. What might the target culture's attitude towards the original sender be? Something to think about too. What is the medium? What is the channel? Is it a spoken Word document, or is it a written document? Are you creating something to be spoken out of something written? Will it be received on the internet? Will it be on television? Will it be in book form? These are all issues that will influence the way you use the language in the target text. The setting, where will the text be published or received? Are the audience experts, educated laymen, completely uninformed? These are all issues that will come into play. The intention of the text refers to the agenda or the point of view of the writer. We can analyze his or her attitude to the subject matter in the use of modal verbs, in the use of hedging language, the use of passives, the use of emotional tone. Is the text ironic? Is it earnest? Is it in good faith? Is it comedic? What is the sender trying to say about the subject matter between the lines? We have the issue of text styles, which can come in the form of narrative text, descriptive text, discussions, dialogues. So these will all influence the way the language is used. Stylistic scales. Texts can range from highly formal to far less formal. And as we saw with the Italian example, the Italian language favors a far more formal and detached and neutral position in telling you how to take your aspirin, rather than the English, which is far more direct. So we have levels of formality which range from official, formal, informal, colloquial, slang, and taboo. Obviously, every text will employ a stylistic register appropriate for its uses within the source culture, but as we've noted, the target culture may not accept the same stylistic scale for that specific text type. We also have different levels of difficulty, and this is where our audience, knowing our audience and their expectations, their level of education, their level of world knowledge will come into play. So we can have simple texts, popular texts, neutral texts, texts for an educated audience, technical texts for a audience inducted into a specific technical field, or highly opaquely technical texts which only the most well-versed members of the society in that particular technical discourse would understand. So we might have texts of an expository nature, like news articles, non-fiction books, textbooks, scientific and medical research, instruction manuals and cookbooks. Descriptive texts like poetry, diary entries, nature writings. Narrative, novels, creative non-fiction, screenplays, biographies, mythology. Persuasive texts, academic papers, opinion and editorial writing, advertising copy, product reviews and cover letters. So these are all texts with a different function which will embody a different mode of using language. And our job is to unpack how the language is used and transfer it appropriately. So I thought we would just maybe look at an example of a text and see what we can make out. I've got 3 closely related texts here, and you can see that the language use is very, very minimal. Most of the impact comes in the form of the imagery. So we've got the first one with a bird, composed of wings and a cigarette butt, and it says cigarette butts are crashing our ecosystem. Cigarette butts are the most littered object on our beaches and leach toxic chemicals that snuff out wildlife. Then we see the fish. Cigarette butts flow downstream and into our food chain. Flick butts find their way into our rivers and ocean, where small animals mistake them for food. If that doesn't kill them, the arsenic and lead they ingest makes its way into tonight's dinner special. Cigarette butts snuff out marine life. Every year, 4.5 trillion flicked cigarette butts find their way into the environment, where animals mistake them for food. And if the plastic filter doesn't kill them, the arsenic and lead they ingest just might. Right, so these 3 texts, if we're going to analyze them, what are they for? If we think of them in terms of Katharina Reis's text types, we would definitely class them as persuasive texts. So these are a form of public service announcement, and they are trying to effect a change in behavior. The target audience is obviously people who smoke. People who don't smoke have no involvement in this particular issue. They're not, let's say, guilty of flicking their cigarette butts out. It would obviously concern not only people who live at the coast, but everybody, because there's this issue of the rivers and the flows going downstream. There are some shocking statistics, like 4.5 trillion flicked cigarettes. There's the use of quite intense language like snuffing out and killing. Plastic filter doesn't kill them. The arsenic and lead that they ingest just might. There is the fear factor in that the cigarette butts that are ingested might make it into your dinner when you eat a piece of fish. So it is very strong, effective language use designed to indicate the dangers of flicking out your cigarette butts when you're done smoking them. So those are elements of the intratextual analysis. Some extra textual things that we might look at is the producer of the text, which is the Surfrider Foundation, which I looked up and found out this is their mission statement. The Surfrider Foundation is dedicated to the protection and enjoyment of the world's oceans, waves and beaches through a powerful activist network. So essentially they are people who are involved in water sports, surfing and what have you, who have a particular love and care for the ocean and are therefore activists in the field of keeping the oceans clean. Right, so just with these simple texts we can see that it's clear who transmits and why, to whom they are transmitting, the way that the language is used is forceful and persuasive. So all these pieces of information will feed into how we produce our translation. What's interesting also is the use of pun. So we have cigarette butts, which we sort of snuff out, and they're using that as a sort of metaphor here, snuffing out wildlife. That's something that would perhaps be difficult to translate or impossible, and you'd have to do something similar or different to maintain that effect. But essentially, if you were to translate this, you would have to do everything in your power to maintain that persuasive impact, which is a combination of strong statistics, strong language, and a sort of aggressive call to action. It's meant to shame or anger you out of doing this activity. So you can see even in a very short text there's a lot to go on if we apply a model of source text analysis. I just want to look at one brief issue, which is the difference between spoken and written language. Sometimes we will have to take a piece of written language and prepare it to be said as a speech or vice versa. This is important also for those of us who are grappling with the difference between interpreting and translation. So if I were to just read out a speech that was actually a piece of writing, I think that would be very difficult for an interpreter because of the huge differences between written and spoken language. It's clearly, I imagine, more easy to interpret something which is just spoken. And so the elements of spoken language are use of personal pronouns, short thought units that are easy to follow, a greater repetition of words and phrases to emphasize ideas. So you would have heard me repeating myself quite a lot in this lecture, stumbling on my words, thinking of things, using hedging language, taking my time, producing sentences that sort of trail off and end up nowhere. These are characteristics of spoken language. We might see colloquial words and contractions which create a lively and conversational tone, familiar words to ensure that the audience understands, and less of these co-textual references, such as mentioned above, as we'll see below, things that signpost the existence of extra information in the text, because spoken language is inside time, so you can't go back. Once the sentence is said, it's said and it enters your memory, whereas a written text is something you can move about freely. If you didn't understand something, you can go back. If you come to something and you want more context on it, you can go forward. Things like that. So written language makes use of infrequent use of personal pronouns. It has more complicated sentence structures. The ideas are repeated through precise and varied language to make the ideas clear. There is a formal tone and an infrequent use of colloquialisms. A rich and precise vocabulary is used regardless of the audience. And it may refer to previously stated information, as in the former. But both, as this diagram would have us subscribe to, is that spoken and written language should both have a logical structure, a cohesive and fluid argument, and a rich and varied evidence also. Okay, so now you will read carefully through the Note document, and your assessment is the application of her model for source text analysis to a piece of writing. Thank you and good luck.